it's very weird. It seems like we haven't done one of these in months and months and months, even though it's been a month since I've seen all of you. And it's something, I guess, the psychology of it's a new year. So happy New Year to everybody, and welcome to our first Zoom Seekers of 2023. And again, just remind you of a couple things. We'll do mute all on the mics, except for our speaker, because otherwise you won't hear him say anything if we mute his mic. And he'll probably, he's already told me, you have a question in the middle of the presentation, just unmute and ask it is just fine. Remind you too, when we go to the share screen, if you need to make the screen bigger, if you look where the screen and all the little icons are, if you go ahead and there's two little, if you hover over with your mouse and you'll see two little white lines, and you can drag those either way to make your screen bigger or smaller, whatever works for you. And we'll do the Q&A at the end. So let me introduce our speaker tonight. Some of you who dive California may be familiar with some of the more common or popular wrecks. The Olympic, which is just outside of the LA breakwater. If you dove the underwater park, chances are you went over to the right to dive the Sujack, which is at the corner of the park, and maybe even got lucky one time. And not that I'd ever advise you to sneak out of the park and dive the Valiant, but the Valiant is off to the other side. And those are probably three of the most common wrecks that are known around Southern California. But there's a ton more, some known and many unknown. And Brett Eldridge is our speaker tonight, and he's sort of developed the passion to go not only find some of these wrecks and dive them, but he's able to photograph them with special equipment and document them and learn a little bit more about them. So instead of me babbling about him and the wrecks and the stuff he does, I'll let him babble about the wrecks and tell you why and how and all that other good stuff. So please give a warm Zoom Seekers welcome to Brett Eldridge.
Thank you.
And now you can go, Brett. It's all yours.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, thanks everybody. And Ken, thanks for the invite. And if people have questions, you can wait till the end, obviously, but if you have a question in the meantime, just unmute and ask your question, and I'll see if I can answer it. All right, I am going to share my screen.
Oops. And Brett, I just muted you by accident. So unmute yourself.
All right.
All right, you're back. You're back.
Perfect. And let's see, is that now full screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. It's really interesting. COVID has really sucked in a lot of ways, but pre-COVID, when I dove, for the most part, I did not dive California. I would travel all over the world and dive. And then when COVID hit, I was like, well, I have to keep diving. It keeps me sane. So I better find a way to dive local. And I started diving local, and I've always been into wrecks. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I started really digging into some of the history, culture, and information on Southern California wrecks. And I've really developed a huge passion for it. So I'm going to go through some of the wrecks I've found, some of the more well-known ones. And then, as Ken talked about, I'm going to show you some of the tools we use to identify wrecks. This wreck here is the USS Burns. And I also, as Ken said, I'm going to guess that a lot of people on this call probably don't know about a lot of these wrecks that are right in our backyard. The USS Burns is about 270 to 280 feet to the sand. It's a actual full-on destroyer. That gun there, the barrel on that gun is 16 feet long. And you can obviously tell there's a lot of fish on the wreck.
Brett, you were looking straight down on that pretty much, right?
That is kind of from above a little bit. You can see the top of the wreck there with the water above it and the fish above that. So it's kind of looking a little bit down angle at the gun from the end of it. And there was 4 or 5 of those guns on the destroyers. So, first of all, I consider myself an explorer. I've probably been to 60 or 70 different countries around the world. We'll talk about some of the wrecks that I've found. I tend to do things that are not common, I guess. I am primarily a wreck diver. It doesn't mean I don't like fish or do other stuff, but 90+% of my dives are on wrecks. We'll talk about why in a minute, but I'm a technical diver. I generally dive with a rebreather. The reason for that is efficiency, gas usage, and depth. Most of my dives, not all of them, but most of them are below recreational limits. I'm going to talk about some wrecks that are within recreational limits, but a lot of them are below. And I'll call it an amateur underwater photographer. The picture that's on this screen is actually taken by a friend of mine, Drew Wilson, another Southern California diver. He's based up in LA. And that is me taking pictures of an airplane that I was the first and only diver on it for a while. It's a Bearcat. We'll talk about that one in a minute. I do have a website in case you're interested. It's called Wrecked in My Revo. Revo is the type of rebreather I dive. And I publish pretty much 95% of what we find, I publish on that blog. So if you're interested in wrecks or, just interested in what's going on in the Southern California dive scene, I'd recommend subscribing to it. If you scroll down the main page, you'll see a little box on the right where you could just put your email in there and subscribe to it. I publish usually once a week or so. So it's not like you're going to get spammed with, 500 emails a day or something. The articles tend to be very in-depth and give the history of wrecks and things like that. So it's a good resource, I think. I'm biased, but I think it's good. So just a little bit of history. I've been wreck diving a lot of places. Truck Lagoon. Ken and I were talking about Truck a little while ago. Bikini Atoll, Palau, Grenada, Malta, Grenada. Oh, it's in there twice. Croatia, Cayman Islands, Hawaii, Florida, Great Lakes, California. I've pretty much run the gamut. I've still got a lot to go. Trust me, there's no end to the amount of wrecks you can dive. That's really just scratching the surface. For those Southern California wreck divers, you might recognize the front of the wreck on the right-hand side. That is a model I built of the Yukon. I'm still working on the model, but that's the Yukon. And a little bit of trivia. If you didn't know that those barrels on that gun on the bow, those barrels are fake. They're not the real barrels. There's a whole story behind that I've detailed in my blog as well. So let's talk a little bit about Southern California wrecks. Most people, when they hear about Southern California diving, I think they think, Shaw's Cove or maybe Point Loma or Catalina, maybe some of the other Channel Islands, which are all great dive spots, and I've been to most of those. Believe it or not, there are a massive amount of wrecks in Southern California. I would posit that there are more, we'll talk about airplanes specifically in a minute, but I would posit that there are more and a greater variety of airplane wrecks in Southern California than anywhere else that I've ever been to diving, which is pretty amazing when you think about that. These are the shipwrecks I've been on in the past 2.5 years. I'm going to guess that like 90% of those are probably names you do not recognize. And again, these are all in Southern California between pretty much, let's say, Santa Monica Bay and the border. The picture in the background is a ship that I was the first diver on. It's called the Mercator. We'll talk about the Mercator in a little bit. And on the left column, you can see the first one. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 or 9 wrecks are wrecks that I don't do this alone. There's some other people I dive with, but those are wrecks that we have found in the past 2.5 years that nobody has ever been on, ever. And quite a few of those we've identified. We'll talk about how I identify them in a little bit, but those are shipwrecks. You can see the Valiant that Ken mentioned, the Ace. There's actually 2 Ace wrecks. There's the A period, C period, E period, which are 3 initials of the guy. That one's down at Dana Point. I was just on that one a couple of weeks ago. And then there's the Ace One that's up in kind of San Pedro area. Most of these I've been on more than once, some of them just once. Some of them are really deep and some are not so deep. Like the Valiant's what, 80 feet, 85 feet, something like that. It's pretty relatively shallow.
Actually, the back end is 60 feet. So
yeah, it's not too deep. These are airplanes. Again, most people have no idea. And by the way, I know of some other ones for sure that aren't on this list that I know about that we're still investigating. For example, I know there's another, what we think is a bearcat in 60 feet of water down by the border of Mexico that we haven't published anything on yet. We're still doing some research on it. But again, we found 5 or 6 new airplanes in the past 2.5 years. And airplanes they're pretty tough to find because they're so small. So I guess my point behind this is, most people don't think of Southern California as a wreck diving destination or that there's even a lot of wrecks here, but there for sure are. So why do I like wreck diving? This is the Valiant that Ken mentioned. It's a beautiful dive site. There's huge streams of kelp coming off the wreck. There's a lot of sea life on it. It's been there a long time. I like wreck diving because wrecks always have a story. They're there for a reason. And I'm a history buff to begin with, mainly World War II, but I like history in general. And part of the fun thing about a wreck is figuring out what's the history. Like, I don't know if people on the call have been on the Valiant, but the Valiant has a really funny history. It was built, it was sold shortly after it was built. The guy who bought it was, a gazillionaire, and he used to have parties, and they were having a party on the Valiant when it was in the harbor at Catalina. And they ran out of fuel oil to heat the thing. And one of the crew went down to fill it up and forgot about it. And it overflowed and a spark hit and it caught on fire. So there's all kinds of weird and fun and interesting history about the wrecks. But I will ask a question. Does anybody see the scorpion fish on these pictures or on it's in the picture? Wrecks are great hiding grounds, and I'm sure there's more than one naturalist on the call or people who like fish, but does anybody see the scorpion fish?
On the right side.
Nope.
That's not it? Okay.
There's obviously the California state fish is over there.
And actually, it's the California state marine fish.
There is. Let's see. I don't know.
State fish is the golden trout.
There is scorpion fish right on the left side.
There he is.
Right there. You can see his tail up there, and his body comes down, and his eyes are kind of right there, and his fin is right there. There's a scorpion fish. They're very good at camouflaging themselves and hiding. But wrecks have a massive amount of life on them if you look. All right, let's see here. This is the Olympic. I think Ken mentioned the Olympic. The Olympic's covered in really, really beautiful strawberry anemones. And there's a ton of nooks and crannies. And, one of the things I like to say is you don't know what you're going to get. And you don't know where you're going to go until you actually go down and start looking around. And there's a lot of places to look in and explore. I've got a ton of training. I would never recommend anybody go into an overhead environment without the proper training. I've had quite a few really crazy things happen inside of wrecks. I won't tell you about those, but they're fascinating places for me. And it does allow you to find new things. I have found new dive sites as well, whether they're reefs and things like that. But it's cool when you can find a new wreck, because it's identifiable. It's like, oh, there's a wreck and it's new and nobody's ever been on it. Let's figure out what it is. And for me, that's really, I'll call it fascinating and fun. It can be boring as well. We'll talk about that. But so maybe I'll talk about just a few of my favorite wrecks. And some of these you might not know. We talked about the Burns a little bit. As I said, it is massive. It sank off San Clemente. The Navy was doing some testing of what they call an MCWLG, which is a huge caliber gun, 8-inch I mean, when you think about an 8-inch projectile, I mean, that's massive, 55 caliber. So it's, you know, the length of the barrel is 55 times the 8 inches. So a really massive gun. They shelled the Burns and sank it. It is about 270, 280 feet to the sand. And, you know, it's got a berth of, call it, I don't know, 40 feet to the top of the wreck is like 235, 240. The gun barrels are 16 feet long. The wreck itself is probably 500 and some odd feet long. And just to give you an idea of the scale, you can see, I took that picture in the bottom left, the guy diving with me, it was just me and one of the guy. He's another local Southern California diver. And you can see the scale of him versus the size of the wreck. I mean, it's just huge beyond belief. And, you know, it's got a ton of fish on it, and it's just beautiful. That day we had on the Burns was amazing. The first dive, that was our second dive of the day, was that one. The first one was on a wreck called the Vamin, which is 340 feet to the sand. And we were just having such a good day that we ended up doing both wrecks in the same day. It was end of November. It was like November 29th or something like that, 2021. So a little over a year ago. This is the Bearcat. It's a very rare airplane. There was only 1,000 of them made. We'll talk about how I identified it in a little bit, but I love this dive site. Unfortunately, I wish more people could see it. This one is deep. It's 230 feet deep. I was the first person ever to dive it. I dove it alone. And I first dove it in June of 2022 and found it and took a bunch of photos to identify it. We identify it. We think we've identified the specific aircraft. We haven't found the what's called a Bureau ID tag, and we haven't scraped off the tail to find the tail number yet. But I'm pretty sure we've positively identified it based on a few different characteristics. Let's see, there's something in chat. I don't know if it's a question or not. Let's see.
Oh, it says what boats?
Yeah, what boats do I use?
Wrecks?
Good question. So I dive primarily on 2 boats. In the Long Beach, San Pedro, Santa Monica area, I dive on the Sundiver with Ray and Kaya. And in the San Diego area, I dive on the Marissa with Laura. Those are the 2 boats that I've made all these discoveries on. This one was with Laura on the Marissa. Good question. The UB-88. The UB-88 is a fantastic wreck. I don't know if people on the call know about this wreck. The bottom left is a photogrammetry model. I built the whole thing. It's 190 feet long. But this, again, it's one of those things where just understanding the history is so fascinating. The UB-88 is a World War I. Yeah, you heard that right. World War I German submarine that sank off of San Pedro. It's about 9 miles out into the shipping channel. So it's a little bit, you have to be really careful. You have to be a very, we call it confident diver, because it is in the shipping channel. It's 190 feet deep to the sand. So it's deep, but it's for me, it's not like really, really hard deep. The top of the conning tower is like 160, 165-ish. So does anybody on the call know the history of the UB-88 and why we have a World War I German submarine off our coast?
I'm going to guess you're going to get no takers on that question.
Well,
All right.
one maybe.
Oh, okay.
This is Jerry, and I think it was brought here. I'm not actually sure of this, but I thought it was brought here after one of the wars for study, and then I thought they sank it on purpose out there, but I may be wrong about that.
You're pretty close. So at the end of World War I, the Germans signed the Armistice Agreement, which basically required them to forfeit ships and tanks and jeeps and things like that. One of the things they forfeited was the UB-88 submarine. It was on the East Coast. It was part of the Wolf Pack on the East Coast that targeted and sank a bunch of ships. It did have some kills to its name. So they forfeited to us, probably in the New Jersey area is my guess. And our Navy learned how to operate it. And they took it down the East Coast of the United States, raising war bonds after World War I. They actually took it through the Panama Canal, all the way up the west coast to Seattle, and then back down to San Pedro. When it was in San Pedro, they salvaged it. So they took out the diesel engines. There's a hole in the hull behind the conning tower, which is like 21 by 29 inches, I believe. I've actually been inside this wreck. That hole is how they took out the diesel engines. So they salvaged most of it out. And then you're right, they did intentionally sink it. They took it out on January 3rd, 1921. So the wreck itself has been down for 102 years plus now. For the past few years, I've tried to dive it on the anniversary. And again, this year I got skunked because of the weather. I just thought it would be very cool to dive it on the anniversary date of the sinking. But, you know, for a World War I German submarine that sank over 100 years ago, it's in relatively good shape. You can see the external hull is cracking away. The front, you can see the 4 torpedo tubes there. There's one in the back. That's what that photo is on the right bottom. That's the back torpedo tube. On the stern, there's a ghost net that goes up on it. But I mean, to think about, we have a World War I German submarine off our coast is pretty fascinating, at least to me. Like I said, I'm a history buff. Has anybody in the call dove the Hogan? The Hogan is within recreational depth. It's about maybe 110 feet to the sand. The bottom there you can see is what I built. It's a photogrammetry model. We'll talk about that in a minute. On the left, you can see the stern. Those little things that point out from the stern are propeller guards, so that when they were docking the ship, it wouldn't hit the dock. The propellers wouldn't. It would stop it. About amidships, a little bit towards the front, you can see those 3 round things. Those are the boilers. The ship originally had 4 boilers. When they retrofitted it to be a minesweeper, they took out one of the boilers to make room for some other stuff. I love the Hogan. That picture on the right is of the stern. You can see the rudder below that. And again, it's got all these just absolutely stunningly beautiful strawberry anemones on it. And the wreck itself is, I don't know, like 350 feet long. It's mainly a debris field, but like I said, if you know what you're looking for, you can see it on the diagram. Then you can find the prop shaft, you can find the boilers. There's always, oh, I shouldn't say that way. Every time I've been on the Hogan, there's been wolf eels that are hiding in the boilers and other areas. So if you're a wolfie fan, I like wolf eels personally, you can usually find them on the Hogan. It's a little bit of a boat ride. It takes a little bit of getting to, but if you've never been on the Hogan, I highly recommend you dive it. Okay, so Ken asked me to talk a little bit about. I'm just going to check the time. Yeah, we're good. He asked me to talk a little bit about how do we find new stuff. I mean, like I said, we found, I don't know, 15 or so new wrecks in the past 2.5 years. We don't have a budget. It's just me and this guy named Tyler Stalter, who's a pretty famous Southern California guy, and Laura on the Marissa and a couple other people. We don't have ROVs. We don't have AUVs. We don't have a big budget. I'm not government funded. I'm semi-retired. I'm doing this stuff for fun. And I'm not trying to brag at all on this, but we have found more wrecks in the past 2 years than have been found in Southern California in the past probably 20 in terms of numbers. Again, part of that's COVID, and I've just been doing a ton of diving in Southern California. So this is kind of like, I'll call it the short version of it. But the first thing we do is we comb through a bunch of data, and this is Tyler's area of expertise. The people I dive with, they all have their kind of like area of expertise. Tyler's is bathymetry data, and kind of like piecing things together. So we look at bathymetry data. On the bottom left, you can see there's a little like white thing that's kind of like sticking up in the middle, somewhat in the middle. That's an airplane. Now, to most people, they'd say like, what? Are you crazy? That actually turned out to be an airplane. But we find little things like that look anomalous. We look at old war diary reports. We look at accident reports. We order some things online like that. We look at Google Maps. Some of the wrecks that you can find, you can actually see them on Google Maps, believe it or not. There's a famous one that's on my list. I'm not going to tell you what it is. But there's a very famous one that I know where it is. There's never been another diver on it. And it's a really famous wreck. And I'm just waiting for the right conditions to go dive it. So newspaper articles, YouTube, sometimes people will post stuff on YouTube. Sometimes people will post pictures of stuff and the GPS coordinates are there. Fishermen, there's all kinds of sources of data. So we take all these sources of data and we basically build a target list for each day that we're going to go look for new stuff. And you can see one down below there. That was our target list for a specific day. It happened to be a very shallow day. These were all, it's in Mission Bay Harbor area, down by the Navy base down there in that harbor. So they were all like, 60, 70, 80 feet targets. And usually, 2, 3, 4 of us will go on the boat and we'll have our target plan and we'll go and we'll look at targets on the sonar. Laura's boat, the Marissa, has regular fish sonar. And then it also has in-hull side scan. So it's not a side scan where you put it in the water and tow it. It's basically in the hull. We look at each one of those targets and we look for anomalies. And you can see on that one, kind of the third column, the pretty blue thing with all the red on it, this little area that's above the 2 in the depth, that is a signature of a wreck. It looks different, right? You can see it's not as dark red. Usually there's fish above it. You can't see fish on this one. So we'll see something like that and we'll say, okay, looks like it's worth diving. It looks like it's a real wreck. Let's go dive it. So, one of us will get in, depends on the depth and who's already had a dive for the day and what surface interval people have done and who's got what gases and stuff, but somebody will dive it. I know this is a little bit of a taboo subject, but I often dive alone. I find it easier and more efficient. And if we're going to dive 5 or 6 targets in a day, not everybody can dive every target. So I'll dive it, or I'll dive with somebody else depending upon what's going on, and we'll look. We've got a pretty good record, but sometimes you don't find what you're looking for. And in fact, I published a story on this called Ed's Mug. On the far right side, you can see that picture. One time I went down and there was a very solid signature. I think it was that one off to the left, the 275-foot one, because Ed's Mug is 275 feet deep. I was absolutely sure we were going to find something. And I got down and I tied off to the down line because the viz was okay, but it was really dark, obviously, at that depth. Then I started looking and I spent about 10 minutes looking and I didn't find anything other than this mug. But you could see around the mug, there's kind of like an outline of almost what looks like a hatch. So, I was getting my deco time was adding up and I was alone. So I called the dive. I personally think there's something still there. I think it's buried in sand and mud, but sometimes you find rocks. You don't always find what you expect you're going to find. We'll talk about that in a minute too. But in this case, I found Ed's Mug, and the reason I know it's Ed's Mug is because on the bottom of the mug there was an inscription that said, "Hey, Ed, thanks for the good times," or something like that. So I took the mug as a souvenir. I usually don't take stuff. I think I can count on like one hand the number of things I've taken from wrecks. Which is not typical for a wreck diver, by the way. Anyway, I built a photogrammetry model and I posted a story about Ed's Mug. So once yeah.
But are you literally anchoring on the wreck?
No.
I mean, no. So how do you make sure when you drop? Because I mean, if with a little bit of current and if you're off by 20 feet, you can completely miss. So how do you make sure you don't miss?
It's a very, very good question. I'm glad you asked it. So we don't use an anchor primarily for 2 reasons. One, I mean, when you start thinking about a 275-foot deep target, putting an anchor down on that is really hard, and then you're literally anchored to it, and you can damage it. I mean, if you're talking an airplane, you put a big anchor through an airplane and it's going to go, like these old airplanes, it's going to go through the wing and it's going to damage it. And we do not want to damage some of these targets, especially if we don't know what they are. So what we do is we take, it depends on the boat, but they take some kind of weight. Sometimes it's a grappling hook with some weight on it. Sometimes it's purely just a weight. and we tie it to a line that we know is long enough, and then we tie a buoy to the top of it. It's called live boating. And what they do is they come over the target, and we're really, really careful, and we go really slow, and we hope for not a lot of wind and current, because that makes it even harder. But we get over the target, we watch it on the sonar, and then right when we're on top of the signature, we throw that thing overboard. And all it's got is the big amount of weight and a rope. And it goes down, and then there's the buoy on top of the water to mark the spot. So then what happens is you get geared up, and when you're ready to go, I mean, like literally ready to jump in the water, everything's on, your rebreather's checked, got your bailout on, everything's ready to go. The boat backs up and drops you onto the downline, and then you follow the downline down. I 100% of the time always put a strobe on the downline. I've got a pretty strong strobe, and I'll look around. If I'm about to lose sight of the strobe or there's a lot of current, I will tie in my own line to the downline so I can always find my way back. And then I'll go and start exploring with my line. If I find something, I'll tie off the line and take photos, and then I'll take the line and go back to the downline. And the rule of thumb is you go down the downline, you come up the downline. I mean, we always have SMBs. We have two in this kind of diving. You have an orange one, which is just like, I got off the downline for whatever reason. Here's where I am. And then you have a yellow one, which is I'm off the downline and I need in-water help. But usually it's a downline process, not anchoring.
Thank you.
Yep. So identifying an airplane is a pretty fun and unique process. I thought I'd talk a little bit about it. So basically what we do, the first thing we do is we gather, I take photos. That's kind of part of my job on the team is photography. So I take photos, and then we look at those photos and analyze them for unique things. Generally on an airplane, what we look at is the type of engine. Is it a round radial engine? Is it one engine? Is it two? How many prop blades are on it? How many cylinders are on it? You can literally start counting the cylinders. How many rows of cylinders are on it? So the engine is a good way to start the identification process, because that will narrow it down. I mean, some of the engines, like the Pratt & Whitney double WASP engine, was in like 8 or 10 different types of airplanes. So it narrows it down, but it doesn't identify it specifically. And then we look at other features. You can see in the bottom left, this was from the Bearcat. This is what actually tipped me off and allowed us to do a positive ID on the type of airplane. There's that little air intake on the root of the wing, which is pretty unique. There's not a lot of propeller-driven airplanes that had that. In fact, I think the F-8F Bearcat's the only one. So we identified the type of airplane. I built a photogrammetry model, and on the model, I measured the relative wingspan to length of the airplane to help solidify the fact that it matched a Bearcat. So we try to identify the type of airplane first, and then we try to look through historical data to see if we can identify the actual airplane, like the ID. We try to look for ID tags, but a lot of times, after they've been earned, a lot of these were downed in the 40s. They're just worn away, or during the impact, it just got separated. And then we iterate on it, and we do a lot of what I call pressure testing. Like, no, what if that's not true? What if this is true? And then we try to identify it, and we iterate on that process. I'm going to talk about a few of the wrecks just to give you some idea of kind of some of the challenges and fun things involved in the detective work. Again, this is the Mercator. It's in Santa Monica Bay. A lot of people have been looking for it for a long time. And I got lucky. I was out with Ray Arntz on the Sundiver, and he had a target that he had never put anybody on. He said, hey, why don't you go dive this? I'll take you to it. And I did. And I was the first person. I was diving alone on the Mercator. The interesting thing about the Mercator is when I got on the wreck, the first thing I thought is, okay, it looks like a fishing vessel. Like, I was pretty sure it was a fishing vessel. It had like the mast, it had a crow's nest, it had some machinery, it had some things that I thought, like, okay, this is a fishing vessel, but there was no nets. And when a fishing boat sinks, it almost always has nets on it. Like, I can't think of another wreck I've been on that doesn't have nets. That's a fishing vessel. Midnight Hour has them, the Ace has them, the Infidel has them. They all have the nets on them when they sink. And And I noticed, you can see on the lower right photo, I noticed this tube with holes in it that was kind of like white and plastic. So I was very confused. So I did a dive alone, and then Tyler and I, one of my dive buddies, went back up a week or two later, and we did another dive on it. We actually brought a tape measure, you can see it there, to measure the length from by this time we had a theory that it was a Mercator, but I still couldn't explain the nets. So we went back to see if we could find any plates with the ship name on it, or the bell, or anything with that could help us positively identify it. I'm the type of person where I'm not going to put out an identification until I'm 90+% sure. So no nets. It was the right length after we measured it, but it still didn't add up. So my mom lives in San Pedro. I grew up there, and she knows the lady who runs the historical society. So she said, "Why don't you talk to this lady about it?" Because the Mercator was a fishing vessel from San Pedro. So I contacted this lady, and she had sent me, one of the people she works for sent me this newspaper article about the sinking that I couldn't find. I did not have this article in my cache. I have a pretty good cache of articles. And one of the things it said in the article was the catch was completely lost, but the crew was able to save the Mercator's net. So this was the big piece of the puzzle that really clued me in that it was the Mercator, because it didn't have the net. The reason it didn't have a net is because they were able to save it. Nets were worth a lot of money. So they saved the net. And that white tube was an aeration tube to keep the water aerated, because the Mercator was fishing for sardines that you keep live in the boat. So then it all added up, and I was like, okay, it's the Mercator. So anyway, that was a fun one. This one was even better. I called it the tail of the tail code. And again, all this stuff is detailed on my website, and details and photos and everything else. We found a helicopter off of Imperial Beach, 210 feet deep. We knew it was a Sea King, and we knew that because of the rotor. It's got a very distinctive rotor. And we thought for a little while that we had found a very famous helicopter, probably the most famous helicopter in the world, called Hilo 66. Hilo 66 was responsible for basically the Apollo moon missions. So if you look up your history pictures and you look like Apollo moon mission or whatever, you'll see a picture of a helicopter, and on the tail of the helicopter it will say Hilo 66, and it sank during a training mission off Imperial Beach. It was reported by the Navy to be in like 5,000 feet of water in the canyon down there. But there's been persistent internet rumors that it's in 220 feet of water. So when we found a Sea King, which is Hilo 66, when we found a Sea King in 210 feet of water, we thought we have found the most famous helicopter in the world. My God. But then we started digging into things, and that the report by the Navy on Hilo 66 is very heavily redacted. So I filed a Freedom of Information Act, a FOA, on it, but they didn't release it to me. In the middle picture, that's Tyler looking at what's called a sonar buoy. And on the right, you can see all the cable from the sonar buoy. These were anti-submarine helicopters where they would dip a sonar buoy into the water. Long story short, we ended up identifying it as not Hilo 66 because the sonar buoy was deployed when Hilo 66 crashed, and it was right next to the wreck in this case. The paint color was the wrong paint color. The old helicopters were painted gray, and this one was painted white. But we still didn't know what it was. We knew it wasn't the Sea King. And I had a bunch of pictures, but I also, usually when I take pictures, I have a GoPro mounted on top of my camera. And it's a good thing I did, because I didn't get a picture of all this detail, but I started looking at the tail code. And I knew the first letter was N. In the second letter, you can see there's only a portion of it there. And it looks like it's kind of like stopped. It doesn't go all the way up or continue up the vertical axes. And finding that second letter and identifying it was key to identifying the wreck. We actually ended up identifying it. There's 2 or 3 of these that had been wrecked down there. So we wanted to find the right one. We found the right one. And ended up being NS. S is in Sam. I wrote about the whole thing. The guy who was piloting the helicopter, there was 3 guys in the helicopter. One guy died, unfortunately. His wife was 3 months pregnant when he died. His name is Gustav Hermann. She widowed, obviously, and she remarried, but they had just gotten married. And like I said, she was 3 months pregnant when his helicopter went down. So the pilot got in touch with me, and we ended up taking the family down there to do a memorial for the guy who died. So it's, like I said, it's part of the reason I like diving wrecks is because there is a history. There's something there. And, we allowed her to, I guess, have some peace and closure because the Navy had told her, we're never going to find his helicopter. Like, it's probably in pieces on the ocean floor, and we don't know exactly where it is, and we're never going to find it. And we happened to find it. So that's the tale of the tail code. I want to talk a little bit about photogrammetry. Photogrammetry is, this isn't my definition, but I think it's an apt one. It's the art and science of extracting 3D information from 2D pictures. And I started getting into photogrammetry during COVID. I'm a very active person. I can't sit still. I can't not do stuff. So during COVID, I took up wreck diving in Southern California, finding new wrecks. And I also took up photogrammetry. Well, I took up photography in general. I had always just kind of clicked away, but I got more serious about it. I took up photogrammetry. So when you think about a photograph, it's actually two-dimensional, right? There's no depth to it. But if you take a lot of photographs of something, an object, and you have the right software and there's enough overlap, the software can figure out where these pictures are in relation to each other, and you can build three-dimensional models from it. So I've picked up photogrammetry quite extensively, actually. Just really quickly, there's basically 4 steps in the process. You take a bunch of photos. There's got to be about a 50 to 75% overlap between all the photos for the software to identify where they are in relation to each other. You generate what's called depth maps in a dense cloud. Then you generate what's called a solid model. And then you generate a texture on top of it. This is actually a landing craft that's off of Kona, Hawaii. So if you're in Hawaii, you can go dive this. It's not very deep. It's, 80-ish feet deep. 90 feet deep. There you go. And, some people think wow, photogrammetry, man, that's really complex stuff. I can never do that. And I can tell you right now that you can. That model was built with a GoPro. I literally took a GoPro. That's the only camera I had with me. I was traveling with my wife on vacation, and I don't bring a lot of dive gear when I travel with her on vacation. She doesn't dive, so I just fart around. But I took a GoPro, took 200 photos, literally click, 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 swam around the thing and put it into the software and built the model. So, I don't want you to think man, this is rocket science. You got to have 5 engineering degrees to do it. It's not true. To do some of the more complex stuff you do, multiple dive models and things like that. But, this is, like I said, anybody on this call could probably dive that wreck. It's 90 feet deep and build a model. So part of the reason for photogrammetry is it gives you the ability to see the big picture, especially in Southern California, where we have bad visibility and you can't see everything and you can't see the sizes of things relative to each other. So there's pictures of the Bearcat. Looks pretty cool, right? It's you can tell it's an airplane. You can tell the prop is still on it, which tells you something about the wreck. You can see some features of it, but man, that looks a lot better. It's wow, I can actually make out what it is. So photogrammetry is really useful for, I call it, seeing the big picture. And as I said before, this is the initial model I built off the first dive I did. I went back and built that one. I just was back December 19th to go take pictures for that version of it. But the initial version, I was mainly just trying to identify it. And I measured, on photogrammetry, I don't have GPS coordinates, so I can't tell you the absolute length of something, but I can tell you ratios that are accurate. So if I measure on a model the length and the wingspan, I can tell you relatively accurately what the ratio of that is. And then I can take that and I can compare it to the published specifications for the Bearcat. And I can say okay, as a data point, it doesn't 100% identify it, but as a data point, does it match? And the answer is yes. I don't want to run out of time. We'll skip that.
Yeah, you
one.
can go as long as you want. Everybody's sticking around, so don't.
Yeah,
don't
no, I
feel like you
got
gotta
other stuff.
hurry.
It's fine. I'll make my point with other stuff. Well, this one I'll just tell you that there was a group of divers. It's the UB88 guys, and I know these guys. They're very good divers, but they made a mistake in the identification of a Corsair. This Corsair is off of Dana Point, actually. Nobody knows about it really, but they made a mistake. And Tyler and I dove it, and when we looked at the location, we dove it. We read the accident report, and it didn't quite match up. They got the ID right. It is a Corsair, but the accident in the ID that they had, when you trace it back, it had a 4-bladed propeller. And when we looked at this, we thought, like, I don't know, like you could see in that picture on the left, the top blade of the propeller is broken off, but we thought, like, it looks more like a 3-bladed propeller than a 4-bladed one. And, you know, from looking at these pictures, it's pretty hard to tell, right? It's like, you know, I don't know if I would bet a lot of money on whether or not it used to have 4 blades or 3. But when you look at the photogrammetry model, you can really start to put things together and say, like, oh, well, wait a second. Like, if you look at this angle, there's no way. Like, if you look at that top middle picture, you can see that the blade on the left extending out, the one that's missing on the top right, whoops, right up here, this blade that's missing is basically pointing straight up, but the one on the left isn't pointing out. If it was pointing out, it would, at 90 degrees, it would stick up out of the sand, and you can see it's going into the sand. So you can really get some data points on identifying things, and again, see things in relation to each other. Again, here's one of my favorites, the UB88. I think this wreck took me, because of the depth, and on each dive I would get like 20 minutes on the wreck, and do about 45 minutes of deco, 50 minutes, something like that. And so it took me a little bit of time, and I was just learning photogrammetry, and multi-dive models are much harder for a few different reasons. But anyway, I ended up building a whole model of it. And yeah, it took 8 dives. You can see pictures again, Drew, that he goes on quite a few of these with me, and we have this system set up where I use my really bright video lights to take pictures, and he goes off and takes natural light pictures. And it really is I think it's a cool way of looking at things. Again, it gives you a sense of scale. But the model has 2,500 pictures in it. It took about 24 hours on a computer to process it. And that's a pretty reasonably powerful computer. And, you know, one of the things you can do with these models is you can look at what happens over time, right? So that thing on the left is what was done by Gary Fabian and the guys who first found the wreck. They built what's called a photo mosaic. So they overlaid a bunch of pictures and basically manually aligned them with the technology they had. This thing was found back in the 80s to build a photo mosaic. I built a photo mosaic with my pictures, and you can really see over a 20-year period, like this green circle on both of these is the same area on the wreck, and you can really see what has happened over time. And you can see, like, the biggest thing is this whole outer pressure hull has collapsed away. Like before, you really couldn't see the inner torpedo tubes, and then nowadays you can clearly see the 2 torpedo tubes, and there's 2 rows of them, so 4 in total. So photogrammetry is really useful for watching and monitoring the effects over time. I know other people that are doing this with reefs. I'm not a big reef guy, but people are definitely doing it to study reefs and reef growth or lack thereof. So it's useful for a lot of things. Again, seeing the big picture, this is a PBM Mariner, which was a flying boat that crashed off Point Loma. My friend's famous wreck diver, Steve Lawson, he runs the California Wreck Divers website. Steve Lawson found this one with a buddy of his, and he was kind enough to give me and Tyler the coordinates. And you know, you look at these, and you can obviously see you can see an engine, you can see a propeller, you can see another propeller and engine, you can see a wing, but it doesn't tell you like the picture. Whereas something like this, again, this isn't the best model, but you can see, like, oh, there's a tail section off to the left. There's a turret in the middle of the airplane. You can see the big wing. It had like these kind of wings that went like this. It's upside down, by the way, but it had these gull wings. You can see, and whoops, you can see an engine and a prop over here. You can see another prop over here. So you get a really good relationship idea of where things are in relation to each other, and you can kind of connect the different parts and pieces. Here's another one. This is a Corsair. This is within recreational depths. It's close. I think it's like 110, 120 to the sand. It's south of Point Loma. It is dived relatively often, not a ton, maybe 4 or 5 times a year. I've always wanted to build a model of it because, again, this is something you look at it and you're like, oh, there's an engine, there's some other parts, but here's what it looks like from above. And you can clearly see when you look at it from above that here's the engine over here to the right. It's Pratt & Whitney. You can see the thing the propeller went on, and then you can see it basically shot off of the wreck and is displaced by, I don't know, that's probably like 40 feet between the pieces, maybe 35 feet, something like that. On a good day, you could see the 2 different pieces from each other, but it gives you an idea of kind of like, where are things in relation to each other? You can see the wiring harness on the wing. There was a scorpion fish on top of the fuselage. You can see the fuselage. There's a tire in the wing you can see up on the port side, the left side wing. So there's a lot of relative information you can get when you do this. And this model was 771 photos. Here's another one. This is a whale. So a friend, Ben Lair, and I were diving on the Marissa in San Diego. We were looking for airplanes, and we got a signature, and we thought it's an airplane. So Ben and I went down. It was like I think 190-ish feet deep, something like that. Ben went down first. He got to the bottom first. He put the strobe on, and I came down the line, and Ben was coming back up the line to me. And not to use foul language, but he looked at me, and you can kind of talk to each other on rebreathers a little bit because you're talking into, like, you know, helium based, but you're talking into air and not water. And he said, "It's a fucking whale." And so I was like, holy cow. So, I started snapping photos. I didn't really spend a lot of time on it because it wasn't an airplane. But you would look at this and you might think like, oh yeah, it's a whale. But that looks a lot more to like a whale to me in the photos. By the way, you can clearly see on the left here, this little red thing is a weight belt that's got weights on it. And here's the grappling hook. That's what we use. And there's a rope running off of it. That's how we, and you have to know what you're doing. And Laura, the captain of the Marissa, she's very, very good. I mean, you could see that she put the down line like right on the target. You can't get better than that. She's amazing at what she does. But you can clearly see it's a whale, right? You can see the mandible, you can see the lung area, you can see the tail. And for me, this is the power of photogrammetry, is giving you that overall big picture view. I've recently started working on some really large scale models, which have a whole new level of complexity to them for many different reasons. But this is the Yukon. I've now done 8 dives on the Yukon. It's more complete than this. This is a little bit older. Yukon, in case you don't know, the Yukon is a 366-foot long Canadian destroyer in the waters of San Diego. It's like literally 10 minutes outside Mission Beach. It's a fantastic wreck. The sand, this is diveable by everybody on this call probably. It's 100 feet to the sand at the deepest point. The starboard edge of the wreck is at like 60 or 65 feet. So pretty much anybody on this call can dive it. It's got a lot of different nooks and crannies you can go in and out of. The middle area up here by the bridge has started to collapse. It collapsed in the storm about 4 years ago. I don't know what it looks like after this storm. I'm going to go back a week from Sunday maybe and dive it and see. And as I said, the fun trivia story, you can read about the details, but the barrels on this bow gun are fake barrels. They're not the real ones. So I should finish it soon. Hopefully. There's just been some technical complexities on it. Here's the Ruby E. I don't know. Has anybody on the call been on the Ruby E? It's a fantastic wreck. It's see a couple hands. Ruby E is really fun wreck. It's 85 feet to the sand, so it's not very deep. Again, everything is relative in life, but 65-ish feet to the deck. It's an ex-Coast Guard cutter. It was originally designed to do rum running, and so it was designed to interdict during Prohibition. People illegally ferrying bottles of alcohol around up in the Northeast and Alaska waters. And it, by the time it actually got built, it was after Prohibition, so they used it. It was actually served in World War II. So it's got an interesting history of that up in the Aleutian Islands. And then it came back down here. And it was in South America for a while. They turned it into basically a fish holding vessel. And then it got caught smuggling drugs. So the cutter that was used to interdict rum runners was caught smuggling drugs, and it was sank. I've recently started, and again, photogrammetry, it's rare day that you get more than 20 feet of visibility on the Ruby E, but in this case, you can see the entire wreck, right? I'll bring up a live model at the end of my presentation to show you what you can do with it. But on the bottom left, that's actually the inside engine room of the Ruby E. So I started building photogrammetry models of not only the outside spaces, but the inside spaces. The Ruby E had 2 6-cylinder diesel engines, and you can see them there in that screen capture. Here's the Hogan. We talked about this one again. You can see on the model that beautiful stern with all the strawberry anemones on it. There's the 3 boilers. And, you know, for somebody who's never been on the Hogan, if you were to go dive it, you'd probably, I'm not going to say you would get lost, but you wouldn't even know where to start looking because it's a debris field. But if I showed you this picture and I said, okay, the downline is going to be right around the boilers. So, you know, go look in the boilers. Here's what they're going to look like. Here's a close-up of them. And, you know, you'll see some wool fields in that area if you look closely. And then you can go to the stern or you can go to the bow. You get a much better idea of kind of what's there. And again, the Hogan's one of my favorite wrecks. It's got a great history behind it as well. 2023, I'm a planner. A lot of the stuff I work on takes a lot of time to plan, so I have to plan ahead. Got a bunch of domestic stuff. I was supposed to go dive a secret wreck. I was supposed to leave on Thursday night this week and transit to it. It's off San Clemente Island. I'm not going to tell you too much more about it. I had to get permission from the Navy to dive it. They gave me permission. I had a team of divers assembled, and then literally last night they said, sorry, we're closing the area. You can't dive it. I don't think we could have anyway because of the storms. I've been working on this for years. It'll happen eventually. I've got another secret wreck that I plan to dive. It's deep-ish. I'm not going to tell you the depth on it, but it's deep. It's in very, I'll call it treacherous waters. I've been trying for 2 years now to dive it, waiting for the right conditions. So that's on my list. I do want to get to the Oriskany, which is an aircraft carrier. It's one of 3 aircraft carriers you can dive. I want to get to the Oriskany. It's in Florida. It's 210 feet to the sand. I've done a massive amount of research on it. I was supposed to go in this year. Last year, 2022, I was supposed to go. I had the trip all planned, and it got canceled last minute because of the hurricane. And then I have plans to do a bunch of photogrammetry models of stuff I've dove, but I want to build really good models of it. International, I'm going to Antarctica. It's been on my bucket list for a very long time. I'm going in March. I'm going with a lady named Becky Kagan-Schott, who's another really good photographer, and she does photogrammetry as well. So I'm looking forward to spending time with her. I don't think we're going to be doing any wrecks, but I'll sacrifice myself and go take pictures of leopard seals and penguins. I'm going back to Bikini Atoll. There's a whole story behind that. It will be my second trip to Bikini Atoll. The short version is on the first trip, one of the divers got bent and we had to turn around after getting there. And if you know anything about Bikini Atoll, it takes literally 3 days to get there. And then the biggest one on my list is the Britannic. The Britannic is the sister ship to the Titanic. It was, before it became a luxury liner, kind of mid-process, the government requisitioned it and turned it into a hospital ship. So it's a luxury liner turned into a hospital ship. It sank off the coast of Greece, off an island called Kea, K-E-A. While it had a bunch of soldiers and people on it. It hit a German underwater mine and sank. It's deep. It's 400 feet deep to the sand. It's on its side. So the top of the wreck is 300 and some odd feet. So it's a very epic dive, and it takes a crap load of planning and expedition time and other stuff. So I'm working on it. I have tentative dates, but we'll see if it actually happens. So 2023 is shaping up to be a big year for sure. And then here's my contact info. I'm not a Facebook person. I actually just finally created an Instagram. I ended up people saying like, you should publish your photos and models. So I finally started like a Instagram page or whatever you want to call it. Again, I don't have Facebook. I don't have any of those things. I do have my website, Rec to My Revo, which details all of this and a lot more. Prize to anybody who can figure out why I called my Instagram site Second Element Diving. There's a funny joke in there. And that's it. So I did want to, I'll take some questions if people have them, but I did want to show you really quick. I'm going to see if I can do the screen sharing thing. So I want to show you what a live, I'll call it a live photogrammetry model looks like. Let's see here. Stop share. And then I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to pick this.
It worked before. Let's just see, guys. There we go.
So I don't know if everybody, I made a full screen before and I think it got messed up. So I'm not going to make it full screen, but I'm going to enlarge it. So can everybody see the rec?
Yeah, that's
This is on a website. I publish almost all my models to a website called Sketchfab. This is the Ruby E. So you can see that you can rotate it around. There's all the strawberry anemones on the bow of the Ruby E. Here's the pilot house. You can see the pilot house. Here again, this is the interesting use of photogrammetry. You can see the pilot house was right here, right? You could see where it used to be before it slipped off and fell off, probably in a storm. If we go around back, you can see one of the propellers is there. And you can see the rudder and the propeller. This area in the back, I'm going to zoom into it for a second, is where they converted one of the old areas, bunks and stuff, into an area to store fish. And then again, here's the engine room. You can kind of see like through the skylight here that's opened through the exhaust area. You can see the inside of the engine room. Kind of zoom in here a little bit. Back up, but that's the engine room of the Ruby E. It's a little bit tricky with enclosed spaces, but it really gives you an idea of kind of where things are. And if somebody, by the way, I do not recommend going into the Ruby E. It is collapsing. If you are not very, very good with your buoyancy trim and very comfortable being in tight enclosed spaces, do not go inside of here. I've obviously been inside because I took all the pictures, but I think by doing stuff like this, people can go like, oh yeah, that's what's in there. And you can see where it is in the ship and everything else. So that's kind of a live model. And you can go play with this online if you want. All the links are on my website. You can go maneuver it around and do other stuff with it. So that's my spiel, and I'm sticking to it.
There you go. Well, we will we thank you for all this, and we will start off by saying everybody give a good, this is our muted thank you very much, but we'll take a bunch of questions. As tradition has it, I get to start off with the first question. So I just wondering, what I've always viewed as the mecca of American or US wreck diving would be off of North Carolina. Have you been off of any of the Carolina wrecks yet or no?
I have not. It's on my list for sure. I mean, there are so many. I've read the history of North Carolina. There's a couple of really good books on it about the wolf pack and taking down ships. And there's some really deep ones. There's some shallower ones. The primary reason I haven't been in North Carolina yet is that it's very unpredictable conditions. So it's one of these things where you book a week of diving and you hope to get 2 or 3 days. If you're lucky, you get a week, but usually the conditions are very, very temperamental there. So it's on my list. And you know, when I travel for diving, it's an expedition. I don't bring a reg, right? I'm bringing a rebreather. I'm bringing, you know, sometimes 2 dry suits. I dive in a dry suit almost all the time. I'm bringing heated undergarments. I'm shooting to take down elephants when I'm going diving. So it's, you know, I travel with usually about 200 pounds of gear between my camera and my rebreather and all the other stuff. And I don't want to get all the way to North Carolina and have 1 day of diving, but it for sure is on my list.
I will tell you, I dove the the U-352, which is the
Yep.
famous German submarine there,
Yeah.
in 1978, when there were still dead Germans and live torpedoes on it. And we hit it on an excellent day. And it's very interesting. But as you said, it's an unpredictable area. And for those of you who don't know the story of North Carolina wrecks and the German U-boats there, and if you haven't read Shadow Divers, you should, because you'll find out a lot about it there. But it's a very fascinating chapter in history, as well as wrecks and stuff like that. So at this point, who else has quit? Mr. Agronic, have
Yeah.
at it.
By the way, really quick before you get to that, I know Chatterton and Kohler. I did my wreck diving with John Chatterton from Shadow Divers, and I spent a bunch of time with him. And I'm diving Bikini Atoll with Richie Kohler in May and June of this year.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, Brett, that fascinating presentation. Really, really enjoyed it. Two questions. Number one, when you go out for the day, how many dives are you doing, and then how much time in between? And second question is, how deep is too deep for you, where you say, no, I'm not going, I can't go that deep?
So it's a really good question. There's a lot of factors. In a typical day, I will do 1, maybe 2 dives. It really depends on the depth. So in other words, like I recently, last year, I dove a wreck that's been on my list for 2 or 3 years called Deep Throne. It's a very fascinating story. There was probably the worst, one of the worst maritime accidents in the United States history was a submarine off the East Coast. And after that happened, they developed this program with these things called deep sea rescue vehicles, DSRVs. And Deep Throne was a docking station. The idea behind DSRV is that it would go down to the submarine, dock on the submarine, take the sailors out, and do that 2 or 3 times. Anyway, they had to practice docking. And so Deep Throne is a docking station, testing facility outside of San Diego. It's 300 feet deep to the sand. I did it with Drew Wilson, and I did 1 dive that day. The dive was like 2.5 hours. Again, when I was at San Clemente, we did the Vamin, which was 100 meters deep, 330 feet, 340 feet actually to the sand. And then I did the Burns, which is 280 feet in the same day. I will tell you that I slept for almost, not continuously, but I was really tired for about 2 days after that. The decompression wears on your body. The first dive was close to 3 hours on the Vamin, and the Burns was like 2.5. And this was during winter, so we were coming back in the dark. Unfortunately, there's no one answer to your question, but generally 2 dives a day. I generally try to get an hour to an hour and a half of surface interval. The nice thing about a rebreather is I'm not as concerned with the surface interval because even if I have a short surface interval, I will just do more deco. I mean, I don't worry too much about doing deco. Every one of my dives, almost every dive I do is a decompression dive. A lot of what I do is I go based on how I'm feeling. If I'm feeling tired, I won't dive as much. If I'm dehydrated, I won't dive as much. If I'm diving and I'm noticing something weird, or the other thing is I notice a lot, especially when I'm doing photogrammetry and moving a lot. If I do a lot of work on a dive, like if it's what I call a working dive, that's bad in the sense that you're working harder and your body is on-gassing more. So on my computer, it will tell me what's called the gradient factor, which is a measure of basically conservatism. And I will watch my gradient factor and I'll say, you know what, I did a lot of hard work on this dive and I've been tired and I drank a lot of water, but so I'm going to run my gradient factor down to like 65 or 70 and stay in the water. So I'm very cognizant of kind of what's going on in my body. The deepest I'll go, I mean, if I go to the Britannic, I'll go to 400 feet. That dive will be 5 hours long with decompression. The deepest solo I've been is 275. But when you do that kind of diving, there's a time element to it. In other words, and it's an exponential time element. It's not linear. So, there's a thing on computers called @+5, which is if I stay another 5 minutes, what's it going to cost me in decompression? And I'm confident in my abilities as a diver to self-rescue on a rebreather. The limiting factor on a rebreather is the amount of bailout gas you have. So I know, like, if I'm at 275 feet, I might spend 5 minutes there if I'm alone, because I know I have enough gas to get me back up to the surface with about like a 40% extra capacity. But if I spend an extra 5 minutes, it's going to cost me 20 in decompression, literally. Like 5 will cost you 20 at that depth. I'm most comfortable, I guess another way to answer your question is I'm most comfortable in the kind of like, I love the 160 to 220 range, because there's not a lot of people that go there, and a lot of the stuff is untouched and new. You know, you're not going to find a lot of new wrecks in 50 feet of water because they've mostly been found.
Yeah.
But like I'll solo dive to 200 feet all day long. I can't even count the number of solo dives I've done to 200 feet. And I'm not trying to brag, and it's not for everybody. But if you have to, you know, for me to do this stuff, you have to have the conditions aligned. You have to do it during the week, because most of these boats are taking out regular passengers to regular dive sites on weekends. And so diving during the week, finding a buddy that is qualified, that I trust in the water with myself to go to those depths is not easy. Like I'd quite honestly, I'd rather dive alone on a lot of those dives than dive with somebody I don't know. Because now I'm responsible not for myself, but for them. And I don't know if you follow the case in Malta, not that that's going to happen here, but you know, there's some legal precedent now that you're basically legally responsible for your buddy, at least in Malta.
I was going to say, although I'll throw on the other side of that, is most people in the industry are saying that finding in the case that the judge was an idiot and the experts didn't know what they were talking about. There's actually
the world's made of idiots. So
yeah, well, there is, and they run the
of your
world.
peers.
They run the world, and sometimes it takes 15 ballots for them to run the world. Anyhow,
yeah. But I would not recommend, like, quite honestly, I would not recommend doing what I do. And again, that's not an ego thing or a pride thing or anything else. It's just, there are certainly risks in it. I've done enough of it where I feel I can evaluate the risks, and I can make a go, no go decision. And I'll walk away from a dive if it's not the right time, for sure. And you have to be willing to do that. You have to be willing to basically say, you know what, it just doesn't feel right. I'm not going to dive it.
Though you're taking a class with me, you know, I always say you never get hurt on a dive you don't make. So it's Chatterton will tell you that there's only one reason for getting bent, and that is not doing enough decompression. You know, people talk about, what do they call it, like undeserved hits and all this other stuff. There's no such thing. The only reason you get bent is you don't do enough decompression. I am very conservative when it comes to decompression, and I do my time, and I always do more time in the water. And just to touch back on the Malta thing for a second, for those of you who get undercurrent, there's actually a write-up in the January undercurrent about the Malta case that Brett just mentioned. And if you don't get undercurrent and want to read it, shoot me an email and I'll give you my copy of undercurrent for that. Good.
Sorry for such a long answer. Again,
no, it's fine.
You know, those questions where there's no one easy answer, but I'm comfortable diving alone, and the 160 to 220 is kind of a regular dive day for me. And I try to do 2 dives in a day, but if I've done a really long one or I'm tired, I'll just do 1 and call it a day.
Thank you.
Glenn, you got a question there?
Yes. I was just wondering about the nuts and bolts. I got qualified on semi-closed rebreather, and I almost never dive locally at this point. But I was wondering what you have to take 200 pounds of equipment with you when you dive. When you're getting a boat ready, what are your parameters? Is it like a 6-pack with other 1 or 2? I know the sun divers are fairly large boat. Do you have to rent the whole boat?
Yeah. So yeah, the answer is on chartering the boat. The answer is yes, because it's not like they're going, like the sun diver obviously goes, and they'll dive the Valiant occasionally. Sometimes they'll dive some other stuff, but it's not very often, right? And if you're going to go look for new targets, a lot of people, not just because of the depth, but a lot of people don't want to spend their dive day potentially finding rocks. So yeah, you almost always have to charter a boat. I try to defer the cost of the charter by inviting along a couple friends that I'm comfortable having in the water with me. that I'm comfortable aren't going to give away the coordinates and just tell everybody about what we find. Not that I mind if they know what we find, but there are people out there that will rape and pillage some of these wrecks. So we're really careful. Everything we find, we report to the NHHC, the Navy History and Heritage Command, because a lot of these are historic. So I have to be careful who I dive with. I do have a group of friends that I do trust with my life and with stuff. So we'll generally dive on the Marissa or the Sundiver, primarily because it's a really good dive platform for doing technical diving. I mean, we've got a rebreather. Well, everybody has a rebreather. Tyler dives with the open circuit, but he's got doubles. We've got deco gas and bailout gas. There's a lot of stuff. And, some of our dives are 2 or 3 hours. And most people don't want to sit around while you're underwater. So we have, the answer is yes, we have to charter a boat. I'm somewhat fortunate to be able to do that financially. I can't do a ton of it, but I can do it. So that's kind of what we do. I do dive with Steve Lawson. He has his own boat. So, he's got a sonar system and he's another wreck diver. So I go on his boat sometimes. There's another guy named Ross out of Long Beach. Well, he lives up in, I think, Torrance. He's got his own boat, so sometimes we'll use his boat. But on the I'll call it commercial or public boats, we have to charter
I did have a chance to dive the Coolidge in Vanuatu.
Yeah, I haven't been there yet.
However, I was all set to take the advanced training, and I caught a cold.
Oh no!
And of all places, the volcano. So I couldn't switch one with the other. I wish I could have gone down, because evidently it's a shore dive.
Yeah,
but it goes down to
it's on a slope. The Coolidge is on a slope. I haven't been on it, but I know all about it. It's on a slope and it goes down to about 60 meters, a couple hundred feet. It's definitely on my list. It's one of those things where there's not much else to dive in Vanuatu. For me, I'm a wreck diver. So I would spend probably 4 or 5 days diving that wreck and do some really serious exploration of it. I got COVID in Malta this year. I've been wanting to go to Malta as a wreck diving haven. It's amazing there. I did dive before they did the court ruling, but I was in Malta in June and I had an 8-day trip planned, and I got COVID halfway through, so I got 4 days of diving in. But I want to dive the Coolidge. It's on my list to do one of these days.
But see, the good news with COVID in Malta is now you can, with that court ruling, you could blame someone else for giving you the COVID.
Yeah. I was diving with one other person in Malta. It was just me and him. And I tend to dive when I can in small groups with people I highly trust, because we were planning on doing the HMS Olympus, which is the British submarine in 400 feet of water. It's 120 meters deep. And there's not many people I would do that dive with. He was one of them. He didn't get COVID until the very end. So he got 8 days of diving in and then he got COVID.
It's all in the timing.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah,
John. Go ahead, Mark. Mark, you're up, and then John's next.
Well, I actually dove the Coolidge.
Cool.
Yeah, it's really a cool wreck, and for you, Brett, it would be incredibly easy, almost anticlimactic, because it's not really that deep, but it's pretty incredible.
It's big.
It's big. It's big. Yeah. So, what kind of computer do you use?
I use shearwater computers.
And is it which one?
So I know this sounds absurd for what I do. It's not, though. I have 3 computers. The rebreather I dive has 2 of them. One is a Petrol 2 actually, and that is the quote controller for my rebreather. I've got a Nerd 2, which is a monitor for my rebreather. I have 5 oxygen cells in my rebreather. 3 go to the Petrol, 2 go to the Nerd. So it's very, very redundant. And then I dive with a Terek. And the Terek is what they call off-board. So I tell the Terek the oxygen level that I should be breathing if I'm running my rebreather correctly. And it calculates deco based on that. So if I have to bail out and both my rebreather computer fail, I can bail out to my bailout gas and run my deco off my Terek.
So just like dives you do every day, Mark. When we're cleaning the Cousteau plaque at the park,
Yeah, I dive with two computers, but for totally different reasons.
there you
Yeah,
go.
when I dive open circuit, like when I'm diving recreational stuff, I dive with two computers. Even when I'm doing recreational, I dive with I have an old Perdix I have as well. So I'll dive with like a Perdix and a Tarek. I always dive with two computers, always. And on my rebreather, I dive with three. But
And good advice, folks. Even recreationally diving, I dive with a backup computer as well, and you should. And the trick is to make sure the computers, if they're not exactly the same, at least the algorithms are, if not the same, close. So you don't go to your backup computer and go, "Oh shit, I'm in Deco," which sort of defeats the whole purpose. John Lum, you've got the next question.
Three is two, two is one is none.
There you go.
An old wreck diving thing.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. One thing is on your list of wrecks, local wrecks, I didn't see the Star of Scotland. Do you have a different name?
You're right. I've not dived on it. I know about it, but I have not been on it, and I didn't put it on the list. Those are that list. This list that I gave is not all the wrecks. Let's see if I can bring it up. These are the wrecks that I have personally dove in the past 2.5 years.
I see. All right.
Scotland's not on there.
And the second question, I was really amazed by your Ruby E photogrammetry, and the live projection there. That was amazing. And I was wondering how many photos you took and how many hours did it take?
So the Ruby E is about 3,000 photos, including the engine room. The engine room is probably about 600 or 700 of that. The whole model to build it, that's basically a medium resolution model. It took about, from start to finish, probably about 12 hours. On my, I have an iMac Pro, so it's got like an 8-core Xeon, and it's got a graphics processor. Photogrammetry is parts of the processor very heavy on graphics processor. So if you have a good graphics processor, it's going to go faster. But about 12 hours. I did it over, I think, 3 dives or 4 dives I made on the Ruby E to build the model. One was dedicated to the inside area.
Yeah, I was impressed because I have dived it more than once, and yeah, I recognized it.
That's good. If you didn't, I would have done my job poorly.
No, I mean I recognize the inside too.
Yeah, it's a fun wreck for sure. I like. I never thought I would like the Ruby E because it's, I don't know, it's like whatever. But I really like it. It's beautiful. The colors on it are amazing, and the engine room's fun. It's a little space, but it's fun.
Very cool.
Did you have a third question, John?
No, 2 was my limit.
Okay, well, I'm a man who knows his limits. I always appreciate that. Any other questions from the peanut gallery? Well, then once again, we'll do the muted microphone thank you type of thing. I think it was fascinating, Brett. It's an area that a lot of people don't really think about sometimes. And granted, a lot of the wrecks you're doing are probably beyond the recreational depths that a lot of the people on the call dive, but that doesn't mean it's still not interesting to at least hear about and stuff like that. And if any of you are thinking of going to look at those wrecks, I would suggest get extra training before you do so.
Yeah, for sure. Like I've gone through a ton of, I'm fully like full cave certified. Like I've done a ton of training, and I've really, one of the things to be aware of is like you progress in this stuff. It's not like I just started diving to 60 meters alone the day I got trained in my rebreather. I've got like, probably 800 hours of time on my rebreather.
Well, it's like I tell people when we talk about taking classes and stuff like that, I said, I've been teaching diving now for 42 years. I said, I've never had anyone say, you taught me too much.
Yeah.
There's no such thing.
No, for sure not. I learn every dive. I learn something.
Absolutely. Well, again, thanks a lot, Brett. That was great, a great talk, and we appreciate the fact you're our kickoff for 2023. Our next Zoom seekers would normally be on second Tuesday of February is Valentine's Day. So not being an idiot, I moved it one day. So we'll actually go on Wednesday, the 15th. And our speaker will be Dale Scheckler, who will be talking about the best dives in Southern California. Not just, Dale knows a lot about beach dives, but also some of the off-island dives and stuff like that. So that one is going to be on Wednesday, the 15th of February, and again, starting at 7:30. And we'll have the links up on the website and all that other good stuff. So again, Brett, thank you very much for a really great, unique, and informative talk. And at this point, we wish all of you a happy and prosperous new year. And thank you for spending time with us tonight. And we will hope to see you in February on our next Zoom Seekers Call.
Yeah, thanks very much. I love it. I love talking about Rex. You can probably tell that. And like I said, if people want to get in touch with me, they can go to the website. If they have questions after, I do encourage you to sign up for it. There's some really, cool stuff we put on the website for sure.
Very good. All right, everybody. Thanks so much. Dive safely, stay out of the rain, and we will hope to see you next month.
It's always raining underwater.